in two main categories. And one is when we don't acknowledge the feelings that are activating our fear. So, for example, I've had somebody I worked with who was in a car accident like 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier, and they had a driving phobia. They had anxiety whenever they drove. And they had been doing what you're supposed to do, this sort of systematic desensitization. They drove by the place of the accident, but it wasn't working for them. They were still haunted, they were still having to take medication, they still weren't sleeping at night, they still had headaches, and they still were dealing with all sorts of problems in their daily life as a result of not driving. So I took the person to the driving place of the accident, and I said, okay, what are you feeling? And their body starts to get activated, and they were talking about, well, my heart's starting to race and my hands are getting a little bit sticky. And I said, okay, now let's assume that you've got a feeling activated. Now, what kind of emotion is going on here? And we went through, you know, happy, sad, angry, fearful. And it was like, fear. Fear resonated. So we went with, well, what are the two feelings that will cause fear? Well, interpersonally, you have to be feeling threatened, right? And then you can either feel inadequate or helpless. So she started talking. I said, okay, so what was fearful about that accident? And she said, well, I remember being stopped on the corner here, and I remember looking in the mirror, and I could see the person as they were coming towards me. And in my rear view mirror, their eyes were like driving, and I realized they were opening, and I realized they weren't going to stop. And I just remember feeling so helpless. There was nothing I could do because I couldn't get out of the way, and it was too late. And as she was talking, she started to cry, and this anxiety that she had been, you know, suffering from turned into her processing this deep feeling of helplessness, because she was someone who had prided herself in being in control and being on top of her life and getting out of really bad situations, and she was strong and tough. And here she was really helpless, and there was nothing she could do about it. And as she's talking about it and beginning to cry, she was so surprised to have these impressions come up so vividly. She could remember the sound of glass breaking. She could remember what was playing on the radio station, the exact song. She suddenly could remember what she was wearing and how the automobile moved as she got hit. And it was like this flashback kind of coming in, and these were the impressions in the emotional system that had never been processed. And so as she talked about the helplessness and cried about it and let the emotional system do what it does, which is, you know, be sad when it feels that kind of helplessness and feeling trapped, and she cried, and then it was over with, right? The next day we came back, and her SUDS, which is subjective units of distress, had gone from like a 9 or 10 to a 2. And then as we talked a little bit more and she cried a little bit more, they basically went to 0. And with that one processing, all of these other symptoms that she'd been haunted with in her life began to go away, and she was no longer afraid of the dark. The helplessness of being alone in her cabin went away. The stress related to not sleeping and the muscle tension went away. She reduced her meds, and her life changed quite considerably. And, you know, I guess the moral of that story is it's a good example of the potency of going from an anxiety kind of way of looking at that to it's a problem with the emotional processing, and just how effective that was in dealing with it. The other way that we have